For my psychology interview, I decided to interview my grandfather. Not only is he only over 65, he also is one of the biggest influencers in my life. He went through a lot as a child and through his young adulthood, so I figured because of all these experiences that he was faced with, he would be a good person to interview because he had lots of stories to tell and lots of information that I could use to compare to theories we were learning about in class. I started by talking to him about the similarities and differences between adults today and adults during his generation. He listed a lot of different similarities and differences. I think the main difference that stood out to me that he talked about was work ethic, as I talked about in my paper. Just by saying like how work ethic of people in his generation versus today's generation is way different. People in today's generation don't necessarily have as good of a work ethic as people in his generation did, just because they aren't forced to like they were back then. Back then, if you didn't have a good work ethic, you wouldn't get a job and you wouldn't succeed. Whereas now, a lot more people rely on their parents to succeed rather than themselves, which is quite a bit different from when he was a young adult. I also talked to him about some similarities, and he stated that a huge similarity that he has noticed is the adult decisions that you have to make. Even though people are raised differently, they still have to make those adult decisions, such as like financial issues, if someone in your family dies, or really hard decisions that you have to be faced with, or even like traumatic events. As an adult, even if you were raised differently than he was, or people in his generation, you're still having to make those decisions or still facing those tough situations, which is a similarity that he talked about. Another thing that I talked to him about during my interview was how relationships are different. I didn't really talk about this in my paper, but I figured I would cover it in the video. He talked to me about how, like, during his time, relationships were valued more, whether that be friendships or romantic relationships, just like marriages, for instance. You didn't just get married because it was the right thing to do. You married someone that you actually knew, whereas today, I feel like a lot of times people get married to someone that they don't necessarily know super well, or they've only known for a short amount of time, which is way different from back then. Also, the age back then, people got married a lot younger, and it was super uncommon for people to get married even in their like late 20s, whereas today most people don't get married before then because they go to college or they travel abroad and stuff like that. So back then people got married at a lot younger age and even had kids by the time like 18. People were married and even had a kid or two, which is drastically different from today. Another thing that me and my grandpa talked about, which I did talk about in my paper, is personalities. Just not necessarily like how people are like have drastic personality differences between then and today, just because like there was still people who were extroverts or introverts. But I think a big issue that we look at is back then people were forced to be very personable and very outgoing and social because they were required to. That was the only way you would communicate with people. Whereas today you have social media and texting and emailing and stuff like that, where you aren't forced to have those face-to-face relationships like they were back then. I can just text someone and not have to worry about what I'm wearing or how I'm presenting myself. Whereas back then you were forced to utilize people skills, and I don't think you have to do that as much in today's society. Even with jobs, like a lot of people work from home, so they aren't forced to be professional or stuff like that. Like you can just do your work in your pajamas, when back then you were required to have face-to-face interactions on a daily basis, which required you to be more personable and have better communication and people skills. A theory that I looked at for like that related to this was Erikson's theory of intimacy versus isolation. He said that people were meant to be meant to have human interactions and not be in isolation. And while I still think that's true, I definitely think that it's less true than it used to be, because those personal interactions and human connections are sometimes more through a screen rather than face to face like they were when my grandpa was a young adult. Overall, through this assignment, I not only got to learn more about my grandpa that I didn't necessarily know before, but it gave me a better understanding on what we're learning in class right now, as well as give me another resource to connect ideas together So when it comes time to study or like use this in real life experiences, I have another bridge that I can bridge, another resource to bridge the gap between like understanding of what we're talking about and connecting that to real life personal experiences, not necessarily for me, but for my family members, which I'm really close with. Thank you.